I definitely wanted to ask you about the nutrition side of things because are you still keto, low carb?
Yeah. I've been doing the way I like to describe this, because it gets so confusing to people, I think, where they hear keto and some people will think that's just kind of like generally low carb, whereas other people will think it's no carb. So like what I'll say is like a strict ketogenic diet or a very low carbohydrate diet is like a pretty aggressive formula where you're looking at like probably 30 to 50 grams of carbohydrate or less per day. For all intensive purposes, it's basically no carbohydrate, because once you get around to adding like any even non-starchy vegetable to your diet, you're going to get to 30 grams pretty quick.
Right. It's like a banana or something.
Yeah, exactly. It is a banana. Yeah. So so it's basically the removal of what most people would think of as a carbohydrate source.
Okay.
I don't do that very often. I will flex in a strict ketogenic diet once in a while, like in an off season, if I'm doing like 4 weeks unstructured after like a big racing season or something like that. Sometimes I'll do something close to that. Once I get into training, I'm doing what I would call a low carbohydrate diet, which has a lot more range to it. So a low carbohydrate diet, essentially, as I'm going to define it, is anything like above strict ketogenic to a point where your fats are still the primary macronutrient when you also add in the protein and carbohydrate side. So for me, sometimes that means I'm taking in more carbohydrates than other times. I tend to take in more carbohydrate around the times of training when I'm doing short intervals and long intervals, because those are the ones where I find like, and I think the research would suggest this as well, that it's going to be some benefit to have carbohydrate. I think you can get a lot more creative than most people do, where they just think of like carbohydrate as this has to be the foundation of my nutrition. Whereas if you just get a little more strategic about where you're placing it, you can probably do more with less. But less is going to be relative to the person. So I might be doing a little more carbohydrate than I normally would, or what my yearly average would be is maybe one way to look at it during those short interval, long interval phases. Once I get into long run development stuff and I'm keeping things mostly around my aerobic threshold or below, that part of the year I can sort of lean into lower. I'm still not going strict ketogenic at that point, because I definitely still want to use carbohydrates on race day. So I'm not looking for that trade-off of significantly down-regulating my body's ability to use exogenous carbohydrates either. But I also recognize that fuel source isn't as necessary as it was when I was trying to hit that VO2 max or lactate threshold intensity earlier in the plan. So I'm still like, I have kind of like a seasonal, I guess, or like a phase of nutrition where it's all kind of under this low carb umbrella, but where under there is going to kind of shift depending on where the focus is in training. And really my goal with that on race day is improve fat oxidation rates to the degree where I can minimize carbohydrate intake during the day to what I consider a manageably digestible amount. So one of the things with ultramarathons is, if you look at the research on just the fueling side of it, which is a big piece to this puzzle, I think, right. You get, and then just fueling the marathon too, but it's really when you get to ultramarathon where like eating becomes a huge component of what's going to happen on race day. So I find for me, if I'm at around 40 grams of carbohydrate per hour, I can get that in most conditions without having any gastrointestinal issues. When I start pushing past that, that's where it starts to get where like, all right, if it's past 50 miles or like 6-7 hours, it starts getting a little more shaky. It gets up to 100 miles. It's like I'm rolling the dice. And that's where a lot of people are. Because if you look at the research on gastrointestinal issues with single-day ultramarathoners, we're looking at about a 50% experience with that. And that's going to range from severe to mild. Mild, most people are going to have to some degree and probably be able to tolerate it. Severe, that's puking up gels, you're just shitting out your nutrition, right? like the stuff you don't want to be doing. It's going to take time off your finish for sure, or add time to your finish for sure.
And just going to be a miserable experience.
Yeah, because you're not actually processing a lot of that. Right. So you have like an upper GI and lower GI distress, and upper GI is going to probably come out the front end. Lower GI is probably coming out the back end.
Do you do fruit or like solid foods or gels, or what do you normally do for carbs during a race?
Yeah, combination. So like I like it to use like a sports product as like part of it, because it's just easy. It's liquid or gel based. So it's quick. It's convenient. Once you start getting to the 100-mile distance though, I think you want a blend of solids and liquid gel stuff.
What gels do you typically use?
I use a company called S Fuels. They make
I haven't heard of them.
Yeah, they're relatively new. They're interesting. They actually fit my lifestyle perfectly because they're a low carbohydrate lifestyle brand.
Oh, nice.
But they work with they do a lot of research for their product with this guy named Dr. Dan Plews out of New Zealand. He's like the age group world record holder for Kona.
Okay.
He's like a half full Ironman guy. He's got an exercise phys lab, and he kind of has a similar nutrition strategy to me. So the whole like catalog is kind of built around kind of my strategy, or the strategy I use, which is like a foundation in fat, and then like right fuel at right time, where you bring in the carbohydrates. So they have like their protein stuff, they have their lifestyle bars that are going to skew low carb, and then they have like they have a powder that's basically a low carb powder too. But their Race Plus and Race Plus gel is what I'm going to use on race day, because that's going to be their carbohydrate based stuff.
Do you know what it's made out of? The ingredients?
For the Race Plus?
Yeah, for the gels.
Oh, like if it's fructose or glucose type combinations?
Yeah, because I use Spring. And it's all like whole foods, which is great.
Yeah. I'd have to pull up their exact formula to tell you like precisely how their split goes. But the way to think about it is like when you're looking at any of these nutrition, there is a digestibility like game you can play. I don't have to play it that precisely because I'm not hitting these like thresholds in most cases. Although I should say, because what you're looking at is a formula of where the research is now. There's definitely people testing. I'm one of them testing on either side of this. Is like you have 60 grams of glucose. That pathway is what your body can kind of digest before you start bottlenecking, and your body's like, okay, more's coming in than we can process.
Is that like per hour? Or
per hour? Yeah,
okay.
Per hour. And then you have 30 grams of fructose.
Okay.
So they're different pathways though.
Interesting.
Yeah. So you can get a double dip there if you want, and you could do 90 grams per hour if you combine those two. This is all in the lab. So like, there's, as we know, the lab and the field don't always match, which is why sometimes people do 90 grams and get to the finish line unscathed, and other people do 90 grams and they show up in the porta potty.
What are examples? You said it was fructose and then
glucose and fructose.
Okay.
Yeah. So
what are examples of those two sources?
So basically, if you think of like glucose is just basically pure sugar.
Okay.
And then fructose is going to be like the fruit based.
Okay.
Yeah. So most sports products are going to do a 2-to-1 blend of those because they know the research. And the last thing a nutrition brand wants is for you to take their product and have a digestive issue.
Right. That's fair enough.
Yeah. So they tend to follow that stuff pretty precisely. So like, I bet you if you brought up Spring's gels, they would probably reflect something similar to that. Yeah. So Single Day Ultra is going to recommend 50 to 70 grams per hour if you're following a moderate carbohydrate diet, which they would recommend. And then from there, they would recommend a process of kind of a mixture between a sports product and a solid food. And that's just going to help with digestion over the course of the long haul.
What do you normally do for solids?
I'll do so I like to contrast what I'm having from a texture and a flavor standpoint, because there's also this thing called palate fatigue, where like you just kind of get sick of doing the same thing over and over again. It could be your favorite thing too. So if I'm doing like a liquid gel based thing for my sports product, it's a little sweeter tasting, it's wet gel. So I'm going crunchy, salty, more savory. So it can be something as simple as a salty cracker or a pretzel, that sort of consistency. The way I structure is I have plan A, plan B. So my plan A is going to be the S Fuels Race Plus. Plan B is going to be the solid food. So that's going to be like something like a salty cracker. Plan C, I'm going to have as kind of like a backup for all of this, where I look at the aid stations and what they have available at the race I'm doing and start figuring out, okay, what are my options? So that in training, I can practice some of those too. So if I get to a point where sometimes it's just pure like psychological to a degree, where it's like, all right, I'm coming into this aid station. This thing looks good and I want that instead. And if it's something I can look forward to and that helps me stay positive, because the whole idea is stay positive. So like if I'm 2 miles out from an aid station and for whatever reason, like that half strip of bacon and that slice of watermelon is just going to get me motivated to focus on that aid station versus the next 30 miles after that, then I'm going to go into that aid station with the intent of using plan C and grabbing that half strip of bacon and slice of watermelon. So
you try to be self-sufficient as much as possible though. Just rely on your own stuff. Yeah.
Because that's the stuff that you can practice and you can sort of like stress test more in training to a degree. So practicing in your long runs is an important aspect, I think. you get the intensity specific to what you're going to do on race day. So you get an idea of like what sits in your stomach at that intensity. Well, since it's a longer run, chances are you're going to cross more weather patterns during that course of that. So you can kind of see what is the difference between this sitting in my stomach in room temperature versus being a little hotter. What kind of combinations am I going to want from a hydration standpoint when I'm eating this versus that? All sorts of different things like that. Just, it's kind of like a practice what you're going to do on race day versus doing something new. I mean, I think you can roll the dice a little bit on race day with aid station stuff if it looks good, like that example I had before. I think you just want to be kind of careful where what looks like the right amount might be like 2, 3, 4 times as much as you should start with. So, so like here's an example, like going to an aid station. Oh, that peanut butter jelly sandwich looks good. Let me have it. You rifle it down, and then you realize as you're leaving the aid station, oh, I ate too much. You don't want that experience either. So I say, if you're going to do something like that, take it with you and start nibbling on it. And nibbling is generally going to be a better idea anyway. So nibble on it. If it sits well in your stomach, you're like, okay, that was what I thought it was going to be. And you just keep nibbling on it so that you're not, overextending yourself either. Yeah. I mean, the nutrition side is crazy. I think with ultramarathon running, because the intensity is so low, it just opens the door to a lot more variety. So my recommendation with people is like, first of all, unless you're really curious about, like, some people are just really curious about low carb because they're like, oh, I like the idea of not having to try to focus on eating as much during the race itself. Some people just, I think dietary like culture, especially online, is just hilarious because it's like people trying to tell everyone what the best way to eat is and that everyone should be doing this or whatever they're doing. When in reality, I think it's more of like, what is a way of eating that you can sustain at the individual level? Like you got to be able to do this over and over again. So find something that you can actually do versus something that you visualize as being cool or great, but then by week 3, you're no longer adhering to it because it's not sustainable for your particular personality or whatever.
Right.
And the nice thing about ultra running is you sort of get that, where from when I started ultra running, it was very much in that same mindset of just like, carbs are king. Everything should be based around carbohydrate. And if not moderate, certainly high, that sort of or if not high, certainly moderate kind of a mindset. And most people are probably going to be moderate carbohydrate. So it's probably a good place to start. I mean, that's where I started. I didn't have any issues really with using carbohydrate when I was racing in college and the shorter stuff and things like that. So like, I think like most people, the way I explain it is if you just blindfolded yourself and went into a grocery store and just started grabbing stuff off the shelf randomly, you'd probably end up in the moderate carb category. Most people are probably not putting a ton of thought into that. So they're probably moderate carbohydrate.
Yeah.
So you can start with that and then kind of see where you go. Where I think it gets interesting is if you're thinking moderate carbohydrate is going to need about a 50 to 70 gram per hour frequency. If there's going to be the range of people who can do that. There's going to be a range of people who can go well above that and be just fine. And there's going to be people who struggle mightily to get anywhere near that. And they're going to be the ones on that where I was talking about before, where like 50% of the people have some sort of gastrointestinal issue. Of that 50%, it's about a 50-50 between like modest to severe. So we're looking at like a quarter to a third of the people are going to have some sort of severe gastrointestinal issue during the course of the day. So my theory is that group of people likely have 2 options. They either have to train themselves to be able to eat at that frequency and not get those issues, or they need to adhere to a dietary practice that allows them to eat what they're currently eating and not have the performance dips that they're going to get by not hitting that 50 to 70 grams. So a lot of times that's where my starting point is with people when I'm coaching. If someone's like, hey, I'm interested in this, what do you think? Or maybe sometimes they'll just straight up ask, like, should I switch to a low carbohydrate diet? And I'm like, well, let's look. We look at their diet and they're like, let's say they're 60% carbohydrate. They've done 7 ultra marathons, 200 milers, and they've never had a digestive issue. Probably not going to switch with them unless they're doing all these and they tell me I haven't had any digestive issues, but I'm only getting in 30 grams per hour. Then we might say, okay, we've got 2 options here. We can try to stress that up to 50 to 70. You can try that, see if that works, because that's probably going to produce a better performance for you on a moderate carbohydrate diet. Or if we suspect or eventually learn that 30, 40 grams is kind of their limit, they're just not going to get past that without really getting risky, then they may be better off kind of just having a foundation of their diet in fat and less in carbohydrate in order to kind of lower that need for them on race day and ease the burden of the logistics and hopefully the gastrointestinal stuff.
Yeah, the nutrition thing is just so subjective to every single person. That's why it's always a horrible idea to just blindly
Yeah.
see some influencer on Instagram
Yeah.
eating a bunch of stuff or recommending stuff and just go out and try it during a race or something. That's
Yeah.
obviously a bad idea.
The nice thing now with ultramarathon is they're getting, I think, a little bit more to the point where they're not being too dogmatic in either direction, at least when you actually sit down and unpack the nuance of it and get past just kind of like the surface level, like argument stuff. And it's more like they're kind of like, get enough protein, like, hit your protein targets, hit your energy intake targets, like don't undereat. like that's going to be more problematic than whatever. Like if you're under eating consistently and you're underweight, like that's going to be a bigger lever to fix than any macronutrient ratio is going to be. So from there, it's like, then it's like whatever your balance is between fats and carbohydrates is probably sort of irrelevant at first, unless like that stuff I said before becomes present to you, where maybe you're someone like myself where I struggle to hit like 70 grams of carbohydrate, 50 grams of carbohydrate in some cases for longer efforts. And generally speaking, I like the lifestyle too. So like from a sustainability standpoint, the repetition day in and day out of the way of eating I have it just works well for me. So some people will be on the opposite end of that spectrum though, and they'll be like, I really want 70% of my intake coming from carbohydrate. So for them, like their lifestyle has to match it.